Hello everybody, welcome back for another Innovation Series demo. In today's demo, I'd like to showcase how we're enabling you to train Poly using OpenAPI Specifications. And this is an early preview, so it is a feature that we've started to productize. However, at this point in time, it's either not available in NA1. Keep in mind I'm recording this March 6th, so if you've seen release number 9 hit production, then this first version should be available. However, this is a feature that we're going to evolve over time. So, depending on when you're watching this video, it might be more mature by the time that you are consuming this video. And generally the flow here is going to be that you have a OpenAPI specification, either as a YAML file or a JSON file. In this first version, it's a downloaded file. In the near future, we'll have it so you can actually provide a link. And you're going to run a couple of commands inside Poly on the client side. For this first release, it's going to be inside the NPM package, the Node client. And then in the subsequent releases, we'll be adding the same capability for Python and for Java. So you would basically run a command which would then generate the Poly API model equivalent in JSON. And here, what's important to note is that you have the option to modify this by hand. If you want to change the names, if you want to change the context, if you want to add your own descriptions, if you don't like the descriptions that were generated by the AI, if the spec didn't have a description in it, you're welcome to modify them. So you do have a point of interjection here if you'd like. However, if your goal is to streamline and automate this, then really anything you don't like at this stage, you should hopefully address in your spec so that this process does not actually involve any human intervention. If your goal is to try and create a seamless automated pipeline for basically enumerating Poly functions in a given environment off of a specification. So you got both choices. Then we have an operation to validate that the model that was generated is good. This is just a sanity check to make sure that Poly will accept the JSON, meaning it's valid according to our structure. So just a quick way to verify. After that, you would run a model train command, which would then turn around and create functions for the new APIs in there, and basically make updates to the existing APIs. This is another point in time thing where in the first release, we're just going to treat everything as an upsert, but in the future, we'll get more sophisticated. I'll touch on that in just a bit. Now keep in mind this catalog is the same unified catalog that could be done through Postman training, or it could contain custom functions that you've deployed to Poly. There's different approaches for different things. I would say a general best practice is if the API is standardized and there is a good spec, you should use the OpenAPI specification. However, if the spec is not good or non-existent, or if the API is kind of customized, let's say objects in a CRM that have custom fields, etc., then you might be better off actually using Postman because it takes into account the reality of what the API returns. So there's a little bit of a trade-off here in both situations. However, I think both approaches have a valid time and place where they make more sense. And then obviously if you're building custom services, custom client functions, those would just be new services you want to build using Poly. And then lastly, the Poly generate command, that's the same command that's used to create the SDKs. That stays unaffected by this process. It pulls the catalog regardless of what approach was used to populate the catalog. It pulls from it and generates SDKs. And also likewise, the AI agent stays unaffected. It doesn't care how you train Poly. It just works off that catalog data. The big value here is that if you do have a spec and the spec is quality and accurate, it's a huge time saver. You can train way faster. I mean, we're talking, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20x the speed of training. So definitely a huge advantage here. The second big thing is the innovation that powers this. So I wouldn't call these super sophisticated innovations. I would say this is more so just an elegant model. I'd say kind of the big innovation here is that ability to normalize both approaches or all three approaches into the catalog, which makes it kind of unified, which gives you more options on what makes the most sense depending on the APIs you're trying to catalog. Also, the ability to kind of streamline this in an automated pipeline, super helpful so that your APIs are immediately kind of updated in Poly after they are changed or deployed. And our vision here is really, like I said, to try and create it so that we can kind of detect nuances. So if you give us a spec and then you give us another spec, we should be able to tell you kind of which functions are impacted. We should just add the new ones. We should maybe leave the existing ones the same. However, if we detect a discrepancy, I think we should give you a choice so that you can choose, hey, I want to go with the new one, or I want to go with the existing one, or I want to actually take a moment and kind of assess it because maybe you want to fix something in the spec, maybe you want to do a manual override, so you'll have that ability. The other big thing is that right now we're focusing on training Poly on APIs that Poly would use or that your consumers would use. We see an opportunity here to also apply the same approach to webhooks so that you can model out what you want an event to look like that you're going to receive. So if there's a spec representing an API that should be implemented, or that you maybe did an API kind of design first approach where you define the spec and now you want to implement it, this is where we would basically use the same approach to train the webhooks. And the last point is kind of the other direction. So today we're focused here on importing specs. However, that catalog, again, whether it's trained off of Postman, OpenAPI specs, or custom functions, we should be able to generate an OpenAPI spec for you so that you have it so that you can actually use it. So you can share it with your partners, consumers, etc. And same idea with Postman. We should be able to generate Postman collections using that catalog that represent some arbitrary subset that you want to maybe share with a partner, etc. So with that, let's jump into VS Code and see what this looks like. So here we are in VS Code. We've got the kind of the famous pet store example that I downloaded as an example. I'm using the JSON version. You can use the .yaml version, same idea. What I'd like to do here is turn this OpenAPI specification into the Poly schema. Note that today the minimum version is 3.0.0. We don't support Swagger 2.0. So the first command we're going to run looks like this. It's npx poly model generate. You specify where the OAS spec is coming from. You specify where you want to put the JSON. You don't have to specify this. It will auto-generate a file for you if you don't provide it. And then -- context of like what poly context should we take all these functions and put them in. So here you get to specify kind of what you'd like it to be. In our case, we might say something like, let's do pet store demo, and that'll be our context. So I'll go ahead and hit enter. And we can see that it's doing the translation. And we can see that it successfully created a new file. And it's placed it in the desired location, which was our poly specs folder. And here we can see that this is now using the poly schema. So we've got our name, context, description. Some of these things will be auto-generated using AI. Other things will be, but it will default to using it from the spec if the spec has it. So spec first, then AI, unless you've disabled AI, in which case it'll be blank. We can see it modeled out the arguments and their respective types and schemas. It modeled out the return type, so we can see that here. And it also generated the poly source, which is how the poly proxy knows how to assemble function calls into API calls. And it's done this actually for a number of functions. So we've got 4 functions in here where it's performed this action. So now I like this. I think this, JSON is correct. However, if you want to modify these things, you can. So again, there's an automation versus kind of one-offness to consider. At your own discretion, feel free to modify this file if you see fit. The next command we'll run is npx poly model validate, and we specify the name of the file. And I just realized this actually needs to be, poly specs / poly file. And we can see the function schema is valid. All the required fields are there. All the structures are valid. So Poly is happy with this schema and ready to import it. Just kind of an aside note, all this is happening by the Poly server. So the client is really just relaying this information to the server. And the reason we did this is so that we can easily add support for Python, Java, and in the future .NET clients as well. And the last command we'll run is to actually include this, to import this poly file into poly server. So basically add these functions to the catalog. And we can see that it's successfully added them. You can see the name and context that they've been placed in, and you can also see that they all have corresponding IDs matching to each function. Now it's also gone ahead and regenerated our library. So if we go to the tree view, we now see pet store, demo, and we see our functions here. And we can now use these functions inside files. Now you'll notice the descriptions are what came from the specs. So, again, this is a sample, so these are not that great, but you might want to kind of consider the information is being provided to your consumers. So really make sure those descriptions are good. So let's go ahead and create a new file here. We'll just call it test3. I guess I have a lot of tests. And we can basically copy the functions, and you can see they're basically just poly functions with the arguments spelled out. So we have add a pet, we have delete a pet, find pet by ID, and find pets. But lastly, I'd like to just show you that Poly also has now become aware of these functions. So the Poly AI assistant can help people both find and use those functions. So I could say something like, how do I add a pet to the pet store? And you can see that it understands the model, it knows how to use it. So with that, thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you get to use this feature in production very soon. Have a nice day.